Hi students, welcome to lesson 14 on recent history. We're getting near the end of the course and here we are um, from about the 1990s to the present, what I'm calling recent history. And one big defining feature of this, especially the 1990s after the fall of the Soviet Union, was this idea that we had reached the end of history and a so-called Pax Americana, meaning a kind of everlasting, um, American ascendancy, peaceful ascendancy over the world, where there would be, harmony and a gradual movement towards ever more world peace under U.S. leadership from then on. A very optimistic feeling after the collapse of the Soviet Union, our arch enemy during the Cold War. Um, Many Americans after 1991 agreed with American intellectual Francis Fukuyama that the world had reached a sort of end of history. This did not mean that people expected literally nothing more to happen, but rather it meant that the big historical questions of the 20th century seemed to have been settled by the collapse of the Soviet Union. Namely, the conclusion that people came to is that socialism is horrible and capitalism is here to stay. And after the 1980s, the feeling about that was the less regulated, the better. Uh, Number two, authoritarian governments are destined to be replaced by more democratic governments. People expected China's Communist Party to fall any day. Same thing with North Korea. In the 1990s, people were optimistically assuming that that would be right around the corner. That would follow closely behind the Soviet Union. And then number three, America is destined to be the world's sole superpower and keeper of world peace for the foreseeable future, similar to kind of the Roman Republic and Roman Empire, governing all of Europe as kind of the sole superpower in the ancient world. Uh, Historians refer to as the Pax Romana. So people talked about the Pax Americana. This, America is the sole superpower. From the 1990s onwards, many people expected that the only conflicts in society and in the world would be relatively tame ones over the minor details of how these principles were to be administered. The fundamentals, democratic capitalism with America leading the way, seemed unquestionable. Uh, but then we get to Ross Perot, which signals that not everything was rosy. Not everything seemed rosy. For example, Ross Perot ran as an independent candidate for president in 1992 on a platform of complaining that the U.S. budget and economy were on an unsustainable path, which could only be fixed by less free trade and more protectionism, namely tariffs. If the U.S. didn't institute these tariffs and get rid of policies like the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, Ross Perot warned that there's going to be a giant sucking sound, as he said, meaning of jobs leaving the U.S. and moving to Mexico. Ross Perot won a shocking 19% of the vote, which is amazing for a third-party candidate. In a way, Ross Perot's campaign foreshadowed the resurgence of the idea of protective tariffs in Donald Trump's 2016 campaign. But overall, still the 1990s, it did have its fair share of scandals, such as Bill Clinton's sex scandal with Monica Lewinsky. But overall, the 1990s in hindsight seems remarkably stable and prosperous compared to the decade afterwards. In the early 2000s, a minor economic crisis unfolded with the bankruptcy of many dot-com businesses that had been the subject of feverish speculation in the early days of the internet. And then just a year later, America's problems in the Middle East returned, simmering resentment among a small but significant section of Middle Easterners against the U.S. for the U.S. support of Israel, the U.S.'s alliance with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, which was seen as corrupt, and America's unwelcome cultural influences on the Middle East, motivated Al Qaeda's September 11th hijackings and attacks on the World Trade Center and Pentagon. Many Americans suddenly felt a bit like they had after the Pearl Harbor attack in 1941. The difference was this time the enemy was far more elusive. When the U.S. learned that the Afghan government, the Taliban, was sheltering the organization Al-Qaeda, thought to be responsible for the 9/11 attacks, the U.S. delivered an ultimatum to the Taliban to hand over all agents of Al-Qaeda in Afghan territory or else. The Taliban would not cooperate, so thus began the U.S. invasion and occupation of Afghanistan, a mission still ongoing as of today in 2019, 18 years later. Osama bin Laden, the mastermind thought to be behind the 9/11 attacks, is now long since gone, but there have arisen a steady supply of Middle Easterners to take up his place in his vision of combating American influence in the Middle East. The 9/11 attacks also inspired the 2003 American invasion of Iraq, the so-called Second Persian Gulf War. The American government was on heightened alert after the 9/11 attacks. The George W. Bush administration began to claim that Saddam Hussein's government in Iraq was another threat that needed to be preemptively neutralized, allegedly because he had cooperated with Al-Qaeda and because he was developing weapons of mass destruction that he planned to use on the U.S. These allegations became hotly debated and are doubted by many historians in hindsight, and were doubted by many Americans even at the time. Many Americans were more cynical and thought that this was a war for oil. So you had slogans like "No blood for oil," from anti-war protesters at the time. As a result, the entire Middle East became destabilized, opening the door for later groups like the Islamic State to attract desperate followers from countries that had been torn by war and anarchy, and these followers were drawn to the vision of forging a new, strong, stable, and ultra-Orthodox Islamic caliphate as the cure to all this upheaval. Like Ronald Reagan, George W. Bush paired his military spending on these foreign conflicts with tax cuts, which sent the federal budget deficit skyrocketing and interest rates creeping upwards, especially long-term interest rates on home mortgages. These rates hit the breaking point in 2007 as Americans increasingly found that they could not make their mortgage payments with interest rates inching higher and higher. As homeowners began to default, banks whose loans were going up in smoke suddenly found themselves in dire situations. While there was, thanks to the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, very little threat that ordinary depositors would lose their money in the 2007-2008 financial crisis, banks' investments in each other were not so similarly insured. The question then became, would the U.S. government bail out these banks just as the FDIC promised to bail out depositors if need be? Many people warned that banks should not be bailed out, as that would just increase risk-taking behavior among these banks next time. However, the Bush administration and the Obama administration, which took office in 2009, both agreed that something needed to be done to prevent another Great Depression. The U.S. ended up spending over $700 billion on buying non-performing assets and shares from banks and big companies like General Motors, with the plan being to have these companies buy back these assets when normal economic conditions returned. This was the so-called Troubled Asset Relief Program, or TARP. The populist anger at the way the financial crisis of 2008 played out, with big banks and companies receiving bailouts while unemployment soared to 10% for other Americans, led to two divergent responses. On the left, the Occupy Wall Street movement, in the resurgence of nostalgia for the New Deal and even socialism, or at least Bernie Sanders' version of socialism. And then on the right, the Tea Party movement, the birther movement, led by Donald Trump, who claimed that President Barack Obama had not been a natural-born citizen and thus was ineligible to be president. And then eventually, the so-called alt-right. And that kind of brings us to today, where we are still sorting out this new tendency towards polarization in America. So, and then the discussion forum for this week will ask, which of these events in the last 10 years, or perhaps other events I didn't mention, do you think have been the most impactful and memorable and shocking? And what do you think, what kind of impacts did that event have? So I'll see your discussion posts on the forum, and best wishes.